Hello there, and welcome to the United 24 podcast, and happy 4th of July. How are you celebrating your Independence Day? Getting out the fireworks, going to a parade, concert, meeting up with a family, or going out and having a nice barbecue? However you celebrate it, there's no wrong way. So make sure you get out your flags and have the best 4th of July you possibly can. But what does the idea of America mean in the year 2023? What does America's origins tell us about the America of today? As one of the oldest philosophical maxims in Western thought states, know thyself. And how well do modern-day Americans know America? To some, they say America has seen the best it has seen. The best parts of America are behind her. While others say the best times of America are ahead. Who is right? Who is wrong? Now, these voices are transparent. They speak from a place, a motivation. They have their own set of values, their own worldview, and it is understandable that we have to pick these apart if we're able to understand who we are, what America is, what America can be, what America should be. America is a very interesting idea. It is one of the few nations built upon an idea, and these ideas have roots way beyond America's history. And if America knows its history, then it will know what its future should be. But in order to get to such a place, how do we understand what would of the 7 principal founding fathers, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington, what would they have thought if they could wake up today and see the America after nearly a quarter of a millennia has passed? Do you think they'd be pleased with the progress of America, or do you think they would have had some hesitation or criticism of its history? Or would they be profoundly amused at how technology has developed, how America is number one in the world, both economically, politically, some would say even intellectually? America is one of these nations that has risen up from a colony of the British Empire and has created for itself a sphere of influence around the world. Do you think the Founding Fathers would have had some hesitation on that, on the idea that there should be a standing army, for example, which was mostly resisted by people such as John Adams? I think Thomas Jefferson didn't like the idea. Alexander Hamilton was very keen as part of the Federalist Party of that time. He was very keen on the idea of there being a standing army and creating a national bank, which has been criticised even from Thomas Jefferson, and some of the arguments you would hear about American institutional life can be founded in the American founding and what the founders would have thought at that time. The Federalist Society, which has produced marvellous judges, Supreme Court judges, such as Antonin Scalia, such as Clarence Thomas, the textualism, the originalism of that philosophy. And they always have to go back to the Founding Fathers and what would they have thought at the time of them founding the Constitution and the time it was written, either with intent or the text itself. Originalism is a very conservative philosophy, I guess you could call it. And it obviously goes back to the division of powers. And it is extremely important how America works in legal theory, in political theory, in philosophy, ideology. Of course, America was, you could argue the case, was founded as a, some have argued America was founded as a religious, as a shining beacon on the hill, as a religious state. You could say that. You could also say that America was founded as an ideological state, a state with ideology. And that is a very, very easy argument to make. Antoine de Tracy, who was a Frenchman during the French Revolution, he is the father of ideology, and Thomas Jefferson was a major admirer of Antoine, and he translated his book, The Father of Ideology, into English for the American public to read. So you could say that ideology itself was introduced to America very early on. And even when we go back to the founding of liberalism, the founding of conservatism being a reaction, the father of conservatism generally being accepted to be Edmund Burke. Of course, conservatism goes way back, much further back than that, but Edmund Burke, the founder of conservatism, he believed in the American cause. He believed what they were arguing was correct, was right, was moral, and the British Empire at that time was in the wrong. And he even created a middle ground. He heard the calls of America, he read the appeals, and he formulated his own ideas to try and resolve the chaos between the British Empire at that time, the Parliament, which was the democratic institution at that time, King George, which would have been the executive of the British Empire, and, of course, the American rebels, but, of course, they had no official representation until they created the Continental Congress, or their local assembly. Benjamin Franklin, of course, there's 5 states in which America mostly gets its ideas from. Of course, being the Iroquois Confederacy by Benjamin Franklin, France, by way of ideas such as liberalism, the Enlightenment, etc. Another one is Britain. Obviously, many of these founding fathers would have seen themselves as British subjects at that time, and the main idea would have been no taxation without representation. But of course, the British Empire at that time did not see the advantages of having the Americans decide for themselves what they should be doing with their own political lives, with their own worldview, with their own cause. And there was questions, should America have its own foreign policy? It was a very alien idea to the British Empire at that time. And certainly the Whig elites and but of course, Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism, was a Whig. He wasn't a Tory. And the Whig philosophy at that time was free markets. Of course, America is often argued that it was founded as a corporation, that one of the founding settlements was founded by a corporation which you could invest in, you could buy tracts of land, you could settle in. Of course, the first charter wasn't exactly successful. I think it was rejected at some point. But of course, there was other founding places. Of course, not all foundings were, of course, corporations. Some of them were religious foundings. There was, of course, many religious believers who was trying to escape Europe from an oppressive regime. But just because they were trying to escape an oppressive regime doesn't mean they weren't trying to settle and create what they saw as the right religious conservative state of being and their own religious community based on pure religious ideals, or in this case the Puritans, as they would have been classed as at that time. So there's always been this conflict between America as the corporation, America as the religious state, the shining beacon on the hill, shining city on the hill, and of course the American founding fathers and what they thought America was, and what they thought the average American thought America was. And not only that, but what they thought that America wanted to be. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams are probably 2 very, very good examples, because both of them were, of course, all the American founding fathers were were well educated. They had a good understanding of history. Of course, the 5 states where America mainly gets its ideas from, you can argue, is, of course, Britain, France, the Iroquois Confederacy, the Confederacy of Benjamin Franklin, because he believed all these states could have their own ideas and their own way of interpreting their laws. And, of course, you could have a central figure on top. That was his theory. Of course, his theory wasn't the most prominent one. Alexander Hamilton just wanted almost just a carbon copy of Britain, just for the American colonies. John Adams believed that a state was built not on men, but on laws. There was even a time where he was offered a position by the British Empire, a very prominent position. And, of course, he even famously defended British soldiers when they supposedly attacked the crowd. So he was not above defending anyone for any reason, because he believed the law is neutral, your defence should be neutral, and the prosecution should be neutral. The institutions and the laws should be impartial. They should not favour, without fear or favour. And that was his idea. Thomas Jefferson, of course, had a more could tolerate a more revolutionary bent to ideas. Of course, he had a very favourable view of the French Revolution, even with all its abhorrent violence at that time. But I would say John Adams was probably closer to, you could probably argue he's closer to Edmund Burke, as is Alexander Hamilton in style. Certainly within their perception of what they thought America should be. Even Edmund Burke believed that the American Revolution was one that had positive implications. Now, of course, Edmund Burke, the father of conservatism, didn't agree with all revolutions. He was adamantly against the French Revolution, but being initially for it, or even more, maybe not for it, but certainly more favourable to it. But after he saw what came out of the French Revolution, he could see that it was too idealistic. But of course, it's a very interesting time in human history. The founding, the father of conservatism, the father of liberalism, the father of ideology, all coercing to create ideas on what America should be. So yes, it was Thomas Jefferson who introduced ideology to America. Of course, this is the time in human history, the Enlightenment, in which philosophical ideas become ideological ones. And, of course, ideology is a French word, but in English it simply just means the science of ideas, or the study of ideas. So in that respect, in that reflection, we can come to the conclusion that if you were just studying ideas, I think it was seen as a rather neutral word. Of course, Napoleon, who later came along, didn't certainly see it that way. He blamed most of America's problems on these ideologues, these ideologies. Of course, that's not exactly an unfair statement. If he lived another 200 years, he probably would have seen what ideology would have produced. But of course, we can't judge America in the state of 2023. America is founded in its time and place. It is a product of the Enlightenment. It is a product of the counter-Enlightenment. Of course, the Enlightenment was a very continental idea, but, there was even some debate whether Britain or England, the British Empire, even went through an Enlightenment. These emboilement of liberal ideas. Now, of course, Thomas Jefferson would be seen probably as a classical liberal, although I certainly don't think they would have called themselves classical liberals at that time. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton would probably be seen as more conservative, trying to found America on conservative principles. And by conservative, I don't mean kind of the fusionist ideals of libertarianism, which didn't exist at that time, and conservatism. Conservatism would have been much more high Tory in form, maybe. And certainly, even America at that time certainly had Tories and Tory representatives of living within America before the Revolution. And it is a very interesting time to see the Constitution being developed. Of course, the King George was not was more than beside himself over what was happening in America, and some would even say he went through a mental break at the American Revolution, the American founding, and understanding that he was the monarch who was going to lose a massive... Remember, this was before India was a major part of the empire, etc. British Empire was still in its first phase, still in its infancy. And of course, there have been... Of course, then there was a lot of... there were a lot of olive branches by the American Congress. And it seems that it went on deaf ears during the British elite. They didn't want to listen to America. They thought they were rebels. They thought they were beyond redemption. And if they had won, it's likely all the Founding Fathers would have been taken and mostly prosecuted under to the full extent of the law, which was death by hanging. So you can either hang separately or hang together, but that's how it was at that time. Now, of course, some of the Founding Fathers saw themselves as reclaiming their rights as British citizens, because they believed that they were British subjects, British citizens, they had British rights, they were owed, from birth, freedom, liberty, the idea of norms, traditions, that the British Constitution, the British Parliament, should have afforded them. And they believed that they had representation, they had a stake in the British Crown, in the British Parliament. And it appears that they had not received that. Common law, they believed, was theirs to inherit by right. And they had not been treated fairly or equally under the British Crown as a colony. So the idea of reclaiming these rights, which were rightly afforded to them, they go all the way back to Magna Carta, ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the fall of the ancient Rome, the emergence of England. They saw their history as part of the British history, and they saw this current government as an aberration, as something which has taken away something that was rightfully theirs. Of course, you were born into this world not knowing anything at all, but you need to be refined, cultured, and educated in order to know your freedoms and know your rights, and to make sure you are proactive in whatever mechanism your internal constitutional workings have. Now, of course, there has been an emergence of a distinct conservative tradition, which can be identified with words, deeds, and series of towering political and intellectual figures, among whom we can include probably Sir John Fortescue, Richard Hooker, Sir Edward Coke, John Selden, Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, Sir Matthew Hale, Sir William Temple, John Swift, William Murray, Lord Mansfield, Sir William Blackstone, Joshua Tucker, and of course Edmund Burke of Britain. And I would say the Founding Fathers, which at least you can draw it into the conservative tradition, is of course George Washington, John Jay, John Adams, Gouverneur Morris, and maybe Alexander Hamilton too, if you want to go that far. And of course, if you go a bit later on, you could probably get, at least for the Anglo-American constitutionalism, as it would have been seen at that time, you could probably get, on the system that currently exists within the American system, of course, you could probably get David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, French speakers such as Montesquieu and Vattel, and this political traditionalist view of how things were, how things should be, and how things ought to be, was the way in which things have emerged. Now, of course, Edmund Burke was a It wasn't necessarily a reaction because the French Revolution had not happened, but he could see how it was emerging. The ideas that were coming out were too idealistic. Of course, the French Revolution would lead to the many lessons which would later go on to found socialism in England, and later go down to Marx in England. You know, now I come to think of it, a lot of ideologies have actually been founded in England. Liberalism, conservatism, feminism, socialism. Yeah, it is quite remarkable just how... So England was the intellectual heavyweight of the world at that time, and still has a profound impact today. And America's nature and character has mostly been inherited from that time. Even the Constitution of that time is... take the American Constitution, the first 10 amendments. Now, it's not a coincidence that the number is 10, where America's origins lie. That, of course, goes back to the 10 Commandments, which, of course, is a religious manifestation of the Constitution. And the Constitution itself is the idea that everything that is either inherited either goes back to British constitutional law or British constitutional custom, the institutions, the way in which America ought to be built, and anything that can be found either in the Constitution either comes from one of these times and countries of their time. Ancient Athens, ancient Rome, the Iroquois Confederacy, France, and of course Britain. And all of these ideas have been surmounting an expression of historical relevance of its time, which of course led to the Renaissance, which led to the Enlightenment. And these, of course, were learned men. They knew history quite well. They mainly learned about ancient Athens and Rome through Polybius. No surprise there. Polybius has his own markings. He was, of course, a product of his time, an ancient Roman. And when you see America as not a liberal revolution, but a conservative one, they were doing it to conserve their rights, their customs, their traditions, and they were trying to create what they had been brought up with, what they were born with, what they had known, and what they wanted for future generations. So, in other words, they were trying to conserve what they saw as right. Now, you might say, well, what's the difference between conservative and liberal? Well, there is a difference, and it goes back to mainly the French Revolution and the counter-thoughts of the conservatives at that time. Of course, if a liberal says, I believe in freedom, and a conservative also says, I believe in freedom, they're almost saying two completely different things. Now, because of their expression, but of course their ideological origins, their ideological histories, their philosophical histories. Of course, liberalism going back to somewhat in England, but of course moving on more prominently to France. So you could say France is the birthplace of liberalism, although the first father of liberalism is generally seen as an Englishman. And it was generally part of the plan when they even started to see America as distinct from Britain. They saw it as a way in which you would get all of these ideas, and the best ideas would win out, the type of marketplace of ideas. The inspiration for all of this is normally found either in Magna Carta, something in ancient Rome, something in ancient Athens, but I would say, overall, America is more of ancient Rome than ancient Athens. They saw ancient Athens as a bit of a warning to themselves. This is what happens when you don't have a division of power, when you let power centralize in one authority or another, either in the bureaucracy or, in corporations, or either in the judges or... But mind you, you'd want the authorities of that time to be as democratically accountable as possible. So they generally saw the strongest formation of the true American spirit was in the House. Of course, the Senate they didn't elect, but of course, even though they called it a Senate, of course it was still based on the British experience. The course, the House was based on the House of Commons, the Senate was based on the House of Lords, the executive, which they were wondering should be elected or not, came from the idea of the British monarchy and whether it... And even John Adams at one point wanted many lavish titles for the presidency in order to gain respect from the monarchies of Europe, in order to elucidate better relations from them. And of course, Benjamin Franklin, the ultimate diplomat, had a very good idea, because he'd obviously been a diplomat in Britain for many years before the Revolution. So he had a good understanding of Britain. He had a good understanding of France, or at least his perception of what France was. And of course, this was pre-revolutionary France, and America had great relations with both France before pre-revolution and post-revolution. Although, of course, one is more natural to them than the other. And it is the embodiment of the revolution to be a conservative. To be an American is the same as to be a conservative. Conservatism itself, of course, Edmund Burke certainly wouldn't have called him a conservative. I doubt the word even conservative would even be used until much later on, when it was coined. But when you have a conservative think of ideas, he knows there's a long history of trial and error. But a liberal is more likely to come out of the blue. But this comes back to the idea of how do you produce your ideas? And the way you produce your ideas is either through empiricism, rationalism, and the third one, of course, is revelation. But if we go back to studying the study of ideas, or the science of ideas, and we just use empiricism, which is a conservative way of doing things, and liberalism, which is a rationalism, of course, would be their mainstay, you have to conclude to know what the idea, and how do you judge what is and what is not conservative and liberal. If liberals come to the idea and say, well, I believe in freedom, well, they've just thought about the idea of freedom and they've come to the conclusion that freedom is good because they can theorize it in their mind. That's rationalism. You don't actually need to see things work to actually know they work. Now, conservative in empiricism needs experimentation, needs to learn from experimentation, needs to learn from the real world, needs to learn from nature, from how things really are. Now, a liberal will just say, and there is even some debate whether conservatism is even an ideology. It's just seen as as a way of life. But of course, liberalism doesn't work that way. You can come up with an idea out of nowhere. I've just thought of this brand new utopia, and I believe that it will create this great, wondrous world, which you and I can be a part of. All you have to do is follow me. Now, a conservative would say, well, I quite like the system the way it is, but of course, let's say they were on a desert island, and there was a liberal and a conservative. And a liberal said, I've just thought of this amazing new I've just thought of it in my head, it'll work, because I'm a liberal, I'm a rationalist. I've rationalised my position through axioms, through point of discovery. And the conservative would say, well, don't tell me it'll work, show me it'll work, and then I'll believe you. I want to see it work for myself. That's the difference between a rationalist and an empiricist. Now, of course, both empiricism and rationalism would later go on into Kant's, C-A-N-T, his philosophy, and that would later go on to form the scientific method. So both philosophies combined together create the scientific method. But either way, in philosophy, when you break it down, they both see the world in very different ways. They form their ideas in very it's almost in two different worlds, and how they come to their conclusions. Not to say that you can't combine both of them. The scientific method is obviously one way of doing that, which is a reflection on the half and half philosophical method. Of course, there's a conservative way of coming to a point. There is a liberal way of coming to a point, and of course, you can show in Revelation as a religious conservative way of doing that. So conservatives have two ways of generally getting about their knowledge and the way they see the world. Of course, liberals generally have one, but they can fall back on the other. But of course, they just start at very different places. which is the key here. And of course, later on, they would found their first constitution, which of course had, which was more decentralized, but of course they ran into problems, and before too long, they created their second constitution, in which we still live with the results today. And as you can see, there hasn't been that many amendments. There has been some over time, but not many, not as many as you would think. And it shows that's how a Conservative knows a constitution works, because he empirically looks at the evidence and he says, look, the constitution has lasted, which of course was based on the British Constitution, which has also lasted. And they, of course, didn't have a constitution. It was an unwritten constitution, an unwritten code. There is no statutory law in British law. So there, of course, there were some people of the mind, not necessarily conservative, but liberal. Some liberals believe that, Thomas Jefferson, for example, believed there was even debating whether there should be a constitution. Of course, he wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he wasn't necessarily a staunch believer in the constitution, even though he did help with the French constitution. He believed that you could just meet up once every 25 years and just formulate new ideas to come up with new, instead of just creating a law which you will hope will stand the test of time, which was John Adams' way of seeing it. But of course, that comes from of course, this is the conflict of French ideas and British ideas in American society. Of course, which would not be too dissimilar to other democratic systems and the way they operate. And of course, what does this mean for today, and why is it important? It's important because America's founding was based on very conservative principles and can be seen as a conservative revolution, or at least a reclamation, a restoration of conservative principles within laws. And I think that's a very easy case to be made. But of course, what does this mean for today? Why are we talking about institutions? Of course, institutionalism is a very, very conservative way of seeing it. It's a very classical conservative way of seeing it, in that if the institutions are working well, generally the nation will work well. If they don't work well, if they're too big, and they've become a leviathan upon themselves, and you have your little mini leviathans at both the federal level and the state level, and of course your local level. If you have too many leviathans sucking up power from the individual, from the community, from the family, eventually these institutions will wear thin, and what you will get is an over-bloated multi-corporate system. And if they have no loyalty to the constitution, what you'll get is them working with other governments, other leviathans, much more bigger than your own. Working with communist China, for example, they would see nothing wrong with that. So it is deeply important to see Americanism, the founding of America, as conservative, which it was. Of course, there's a very easy case to be made there, but I think being a conservative, getting involved, being proactive, is what being American is all about. And standing true to the time-old classic ideas which go way beyond the Constitution. And of course the 10 American amendments, 10 constitutional amendments which were created, of course can be placed back to the British Bill of Rights, which was presented to the monarch of that time. And of course it's deeply interesting. America took the best of the past. It didn't just create it out of the present. So America was, of course, a conservative revolution. And not only was it a conservative revolution, it was built on conservative ideals. The right to freedom of speech, the right to the freedom of the press, freedom of thought, freedom of assembly, the freedom of ideas, the marketplace of ideas, the free market, a genuine free market. Not concentrating power in one particular form of government, whether it be the bureaucracy, which it generally is the worst place to put it, judges, unelected bureaucrats, politicians who have been there too long, or the mob. You know, there's a place and a time. But when there is an institution too over-bloated, too powerful. It takes away power from the individual. That's when you need to take back, firstly, the party, the GOP, the Grand Old Party, and then you can start using that as a vehicle to disseminate power back to the individuals of America, to create a future and true Americanism. But, of course, this isn't for free. So, what you should do is you should visit United 24 Vote Red and make sure that you look at what you can do. Try and get involved in your local party. Try and, campaign for your whatever politician you see fits your views the best. I would say go with Buckley's Golden Rule. The most rightward viable candidate is a good way of looking at it. But of course, America is an amazing country. And if you don't use the little power that you do have, you'll eventually lose it. I might leave you with Pascal's wager. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit and shove it into this conversation. If you do nothing, then nothing will happen. Or at least, hopefully nothing will happen. Of course, it never does not happen. It will get worse. So if you do nothing, nothing will happen, or it will get worse. But if you do something and try and do some good, you might get some good out of it. So I would say to you, try and visit the Precinct Strategy website and try and vote our United 24 Vote Red. And make sure you follow us on Twitter. You can follow me at Brill Comment on Twitter. You can follow all our amazing other Twitter personalities. And make sure you go to the website and try and follow as many of us as can. You can find our spaces and make sure you follow each of our hosts. Each of them are amazing, and these are the real people who are doing the actual work to restore the institutions, to install America on founding conservative principles, and to create a better America and create an ever-perfect union that we're ever trying to perfect. Okay, that's from your host, at Brill Comment, and that's where you can find me. And I will hopefully see you again in a fortnight. Thank you very much.